want to welcome everyone on behalf of LSE Cities and the Urban 95 Academy. We're really pleased that you're all here tonight, and to our guests joining us online as well. We're live streaming this event as well. So thank you for being here for this lecture on caregiver well-being and urban policy. Before I get into the topic and introduce our guests, I want to just tell you a little bit of context of what brought us here together in this room tonight. My name is Katie Beck, and I'm a policy fellow at LSE Cities, and I also am the program manager of the Urban 95 Academy, which is an executive education program for urban leaders to help give them the tools to design child-friendly cities. And we're actually in the midst of our 6th cohort of this academy, so we have some very esteemed guests in the room with us, representatives from a number of cities around the world who are committing their time and engaging in thinking about these issues to make their cities more child-friendly and thinking about how they can support children and caregivers in their cities. So welcome to them. We've invited them for this Residence Week in London to really share knowledge and think deeply about these issues, and they will join a growing group of alumni. We have about 900 individuals, urban leaders who've gone through the program so far from 300 cities, and some of them are also joining us online tonight. I think we have around 82 guests online, so welcome to all of you as well. The Urban 95 Academy is a collaboration between LSE Cities and the Van Leer Foundation, and we are lucky tonight to have the Van Leer Foundation represented by Rushda Majid and Victoria Chavez, who've been fabulous partners with us to make this program a reality. So thank you. Without your generous and real collaborative partnership, none of this would be possible. So thank you so much. It's really been incredible to see what we've been able to achieve over the past few years working together. So now I would like to get into the heart of the topic and to introduce our guests. We're joined by 2 brilliant women tonight, and I think it will be a really interesting discussion. So Lucy Jones is an award-winning author and journalist, and this evening we'll be drawing on 2 of your recent books, Lucy. Matrescence, which you may have seen some of Lucy's books on the way in. Matrescence, on the metamorphosis of pregnancy, childbirth and motherhood, and Losing Eden, Why Our Minds Need the Wild. So both of these books explore topics which are very relevant to how we as a society consider well-being and caregiving, which we'll be discussing tonight. So Lucy's kindly agreed to stay for a little while after the talk to sign some books, and our friends at the Gilded Acorn, which is our local campus bookstore, have provided some books. So stick around if you'd like after the talk for that. We're also very lucky tonight to be joined by Dr. Kate Laffan, who is an assistant professor of behavioral science in the psychological and behavioral science department here at the LSE. The core of Kate's work investigates the drivers of human behavior, well-being and design, testing interventions to shape how people act, particularly in relation to planetary health. And Kate's graduate course on happiness is a very popular course here at the university. So we have over an hour together, a little over an hour, to think about what caregiving for young children looks like in society and how it's perceived of and conceived of from an urban policy and design perspective. So I just want to talk for a moment about what I think is a really key part of this issue and something I want us to discuss tonight, which is to consider that people who step into the role of caregiving, particularly of babies and of young children, their brains transform. We know anyone who's a parent knows it's a transformative experience emotionally, but there's a growing body of evidence saying it's really a biologically transforming moment as well. So just like in early childhood or in adolescence, when we kind of really accepted that notion that brains change and it's something to pay attention to, it's also true of the transition to caregiving. And I mean mothers and fathers, but caregivers of all kinds, not necessarily people who've given birth or are biological parents, your book really powerfully paints a picture of this and shows really a lot of evidence that brains of caregivers experience significant plasticity. So new neural connections are being made during this transition, where I think the key point there is that it's the act of caregiving itself that contributes to these changes in our brains. And so I think that's useful for us to focus on tonight, because we're all familiar, I think, with the really strong economic and social arguments for social programs for young children. I hope we're familiar with those arguments, especially our participants in our program. But I think what I hope we can do in this discussion is to expand that understanding to also consider the well-being of caregivers themselves as the fulcrum for happy, healthy children. So the question we want to explore here is, what opportunities are there for cities and for urban policymakers to consider how their policies can support caregivers and their needs during this period of transition, and what better outcomes we might have if policy really considered that. So first, I'll give the floor to Lucy to give us a bit of the background into why she decided to focus her attention on this topic. And then we'll invite Kate to give a response. And then we'll have a wider discussion here about some of the topics that have come up in these books before opening up to take questions from all of you and from our guests online as well. So please join me in welcoming our guests, Lucy Jones and Kate Laffan.
Thank you, Katie. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be in this room with all of you. Thank you to Katie and Urban 95 and LSE Cities for inviting me to be part of this evening. I'm really honoured to be sharing the stage with Dr. Kate Laffan and Dr. Katie Beck. So, a little caveat before I talk. Matrescence, the book that I've written about the transition to parenthood, and the root of my research is about my own experience of becoming a mother as a gestational mother. There are thousands of ways of being a mother, and a talk about matrescence would take days, weeks, months, and volumes of work. So I root my research and writing in my own experience, but I hope that today I can present some of the kind of bare bones of this emerging concept and why this framework is very helpful in thinking about society. I'm just going to, put that on. Cool. So, becoming a mother for me was a big shock. I knew that raising a child would be challenging and it would be serious work, but I did not expect the heft of the change for me, physically, but also psychologically, emotionally, economically, socially. I had no idea that caregiving would clash so acutely with neoliberal economics, and nor how inadequately our society currently cares for new parents and children, and caregivers in general. Schooled in the idealisation of motherhood, I thought I just needed to get on with it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that after my first child was born, something really seismic and dramatic was happening to me. All of the antenatal preparation, all of the literature that I was given by healthcare professionals was focused on the baby, and there was nothing about the maternal experience or particularly the brain changes, which I'll go on to. So I couldn't shake this feeling that something seismic was actually happening, and the idea that I could kind of bounce back from it and go back to work as normal, and that kind of bounce back idea in our culture is very strong. Instead, I felt that my brain had changed, my social role had changed, my relationship had changed, my nervous system felt really different. I couldn't find this experience in any of the major texts that I studied at English literature down the road at UCL, or in the books I'd read after that, or films I watched, or plays I saw. In Western global North culture and literature, this experience of transitioning into parenthood, of bringing a new life into the world, felt very absent, kind of on an existential level. So I couldn't find this in any of the books I was reading except one. I became very obsessed with Kafka's The Metamorphosis, which you might know is about the travelling salesman Gregor Samsa, who turns into an insect overnight. He wakes up and he's a kind of gigantic insect, a cockroach or something. In those early months, everyone was telling me to enjoy every minute. And of course, my baby was spectacular, as all babies are. And it was a blessing and a privilege to become a parent. But I also felt oddly rewired, very vulnerable, and as if I'd kind of disappeared or become invisible. Looking back, I can see that a lot of that was to do with the demands of sleep deprivation in the institution of motherhood, which has very great expectations on mostly mothers not sleeping, but fathers, of course, too. But at the time, I really thought there was something wrong with me. I've since learnt, since publishing this book about a year ago, that I'm definitely not alone. So I began to withdraw and isolate myself. I felt very acutely aware of the kind of stigma around needing to deny the difficulties of the transition to parenthood and to enjoy every minute. And I was eventually diagnosed with postnatal depression. About 9 months in, I had a transformative moment. I read an article in the New York Times by the reproductive psychiatrist Alexandra Sachs called The Birth of a Mother. And in that article, I read the word matrescence for the first time. Who knows the word matrescence or what it means? Can I just get a show of hands? Okay. Well, you're not alone. If you type it on a Word document, you will get the squiggly red line. So Sachs explained that this word matrescence is an anthropological term which was actually coined in the 1970s by the late American anthropologist Dana Raphael. And she wrote about how in most cultures and societies across the world, becoming a parent is seen as a dramatic life event where there are supportive social rites and rituals, ways of acknowledging the heft of the experience, the danger of the experience, the vulnerability of the experience, and that moment of kind of acute dependence. And she wrote that in matrescence, a whole spectrum of emotions are normal. Joy, of course, but also fear, anger, grief, sadness, loneliness. And in reading that word, my shoulders dropped and I felt like I could breathe for the first time, that I wasn't going mad, that this was actually a significant developmental transition which my culture, my society had neglected or forgotten. So I went back to the original book where this word had been coined, and I just want to read you a bit about it, just from the exact source. The critical transition period which has been missed is matrescence, the time of mother becoming, writes Raphael. During this process, this rite of passage, changes occur in a woman's physical state, in her status within the group, in her emotional life, in her focus of daily activity, in her own identity, and in her relationships with all those around her. And so we have the word matrescence, which we can remember by thinking about adolescence. That's kind of how it is pronounced, and the root of the word, and also putrescence as well, which I will go on to talk about, is also a distinct biological reality, as Katie mentioned. So what is matrescence like? And I am talking from a UK perspective in the dominant culture in the global north. Compared with our evolutionary history, where we evolved in small collective caregiving networks, the experience of becoming a parent is often normally borne by a mother and is isolated. So a woman is normally left to it after perhaps 2 weeks of paternity leave in the UK. She will care for the child in the home. She may be judged for breastfeeding, judged for formula feeding. She will likely experience loneliness. So some studies suggest that up to 100% of new parents experience loneliness, and 30% of parents experience chronic loneliness. She may struggle to get back to work because of the cost of childcare, or be faced with the motherhood penalty. She may want to continue the work of raising the child at home rather than paid work, but be unable to because of the cost of living. She may face systemic racism. Black women are 4 times more likely to die in pregnancy or early motherhood, with race as a standalone risk factor. She may become mentally unwell. Studies suggest 20% of women experience a mental health problem in the transition to parenthood. Suicide is a leading cause of death in women in the perinatal period. Matrescence is a distinct biological reality too, with fathers or non-gestational mothers also suffering from mental health problems. She may face stress and burnout, which is experienced, some studies suggest, by 66% of new parents, but also kept silent by the stigmas around the difficulties of this transition and the feeling rules, to use Ali Hochschild's term. So becoming a parent is a great privilege and a blessing, as I've said, but it is also a vulnerable stage in the life course, and this is being underlined and illuminated by the growing science of the parental brain. So in my early matrescence, I had this feeling that my brain was different. I felt hyper anxious, hyper vigilant, very preoccupied by the baby, and that I was kind of becoming something different. And I was so relieved to read that year one of the first landmark studies into how pregnancy changes the brain. So in 2016, a team led by Elselina Huxma and Susanna Carmona published a study which found that pregnancy renders pronounced and significant changes in the brain. It was the first time we've really known that, in terms of the scientific paradigm. And neuroscientists have been building on this research and finding that, for example, the changes in pregnancy and early parenthood are as seismic as those in adolescence. And we all know that adolescents feel kind of weird and they need support and they're vulnerable. But that's the same for matrescence and patrescence. That in that period, there is this seismic, unparalleled plasticity of the brain, which is amazing because it allows people to care for their infants, but it also means a vulnerability. So when the brain is in this plastic state, it is more vulnerable to severe stress. And there's also been lots of research, as Katie mentioned, showing that father brain anatomy changes shape. The brains of adoptive parents and non-gestational mothers, which no one needs this proof, but of their brains change as well. So it's the experience of caregiving, of spending time with the child. It's the infant which is changing the brain in early parenthood. And of course that makes sense. If you look at our evolutionary history, we all evolved in these collective groups. Some recent studies of hunter-gatherer groups today suggests that between 10 and 20 people would respond to an infant in a day, and a mother would be responding between 40 to 60% of the time, which gives you a sense of, perhaps how we've evolved and how we are living today is very different. Pil-Yang Kim, a brilliant neuroscientist, has detailed how matrescence, pregnancy and the postnatal period, is this vulnerable window, and it's particularly sensitive to severe stress. So that can mean environmental stress, poverty, unsafe neighbourhoods, social factors, systemic racism. It can be childhood trauma, it can be birth trauma. And the good news is that we know that social policies can be protective and preventative. So we know that social support can really reduce the stress of this transition. And change is happening. I had my first child in London almost 8 years ago, and I've noticed, I've moved out of London since, but I've noticed how if you go on buses, there are now stickers with a pregnant woman or a person with a child with them to say, that a seat is needed for these caregivers. These things make a really big difference. Maternal mental health clinics are opening, pelvic health clinics are opening. And I think the word and the concept of matrescence and patrescence is really helpful because it helps us to make what is often made invisible for so many different socio-cultural, economic reasons visible. It allows us to kind of illuminate this transition to parenthood, which, by the way, no one knows when it ends. People always ask me, when does matrescence end? Some people would say 7 years, some people say 10 years, some people say never. And if we care more about caregiver well-being, it will be good for the caregivers, it will be good for the children, and it will be also good for our wider society.
We'll put you in the middle.
Thank you so much, Lucy. You've really clearly explained this concept, which I think is really new to a lot of people. So, Kate, I'd love to have you kind of weigh in a little bit. I just wanted to borrow a bit of your terminology. I know that some of your research looks at behavioral science phenomena that are uniquely captured by well-being, such as adaptation to changing life circumstances, which this seems to fit that category really well. So, yeah, I'd love to just hear a little bit of your thoughts and reaction.
Great. So thank you, Katie, for hosting this really interesting event, and Lucy for writing this fantastic book, genuinely. It marries this deeply personal and self-reflective take on your own matrescence with this brilliant sort of exposition of the evidence that is out there, which I think is really, really valuable, as well as being very kind of thoughtful and critical about how society oftentimes underweights, underestimates this transition and fails to celebrate it in the way that we'd ideally like for it to be. I listened to matrescence on audiobook while pushing a pram around the very many urban parks I'm lucky to have in my area of Lewisham, and I'm grateful for the book because you actually read the audiobook, and so unbeknownst to you, you've been kind of a companion to me in the early stages, in that sometimes lonely, sometimes awe-inspiring, sometimes challenging early stages of maternity leave. So yeah, I really was grateful to you, and we've been having a conversation in my head for a while, so it's nice to move it into the room and share it with you guys tonight. There's also something I'm very grateful because it's also caused me to think about my own experiences that I was having and I'm having still on maternity leave, but also my research that I've left behind temporarily in my day job in a sort of a new light. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. So in my day job, I'm a behavioural scientist, and in behavioural science, we really emphasise the idea that we take a human-centred approach or a people-centred approach to trying to understand why people do what they do and design interventions, urban policy, all sorts of kind of policy to shape how people act. And we almost pat ourselves on the back for that. That might not seem that surprising, but we do it in contrast with the rational actor model, which is often how economics thinks about how people behave and what they do. That model basically says that people are sort of these econs that go around making very deliberative, conscious decisions, weighing up the costs and benefits and acting accordingly. I am not a rational actor when I'm pushing that pram around the parks. I'm never a rational actor, to be fair, consistently anyway. So I think behavioural science has something to offer. But what Lucy's book challenged me to do was say, okay, we're not taking a human-centred lens, but what if we took a mother-centred lens or a care of young children-centred lens on the world and tried to understand what are the behaviours we might want to be thinking about, like choices around feeding, like choices around reaching out for help if you need it, making social connections, and also what might be determining whether or not people engage in those choices. So I think you talk a lot about shame in relation to feeding. That's just one area that behavioural science could say something about, because we talk about the importance of context, the importance of emotions. So I'm going to take that central challenge that I think is in matrescence of adopting a mother-centred lens, a carer-centred lens, back into my practice of behavioural science when I go back in the not too distant future. The other area that I work in is subjective wellbeing economics. This area of economics uses individuals' own reports of their well-being. So things like life satisfaction, how you evaluate your life overall or parts of your life, but also more experiential measures, things like how happy do you feel on a day-to-day basis, how stressed, how worried. And I think subjective wellbeing economics does a good job of centering well-being, but again, we're sort of stuck looking at averages. We talk about average Joe, average Jane. When we do heterogeneity analysis, we typically look at, breaking it down by age or by gender. We almost never ask the question of these different transitions in people's lives and how that might be affecting what determines their well-being, what makes happy mothers happy or mothers that are suffering suffer. So in defense of subjective well-being, there are themes that come out in matrescence that would be supported by the literature on the general population. And there's a couple that I'd like to mention. So you really draw, and you have already drawn in your talk, but in the book you talk a lot about your personal experience of both physical and mental health challenges. Subjective well-being economics would be pointing us in the direction as those being like really, really central to well-being. You get those wrong, and that's a very, very detrimental thing for your well-being. There's other themes that come out, things like social isolation. We know that's massively important for how people feel on a day-to-day basis, but also how they evaluate their lives. And when you have a day-to-day companion that is non-verbal and doesn't even smile at you for the first 6 weeks, it almost doesn't matter how well networked you were or connected you were before. That's really, really changes and puts you at risk of being lonely and isolated. There's other things like social comparisons. We're all social beings, and it's normal to look over our shoulders and think, how are people doing? But in caring, it's particularly when you're doing it for the first time and you're a first-time parent, you're kind of flying by the seat of your pants a little bit. And so often you'll look over your shoulder and see how other parents are doing, sleeping, how their kids are eating, growing, sleeping again. And so I think those social comparisons can actually be quite dangerous for our well-being. Then the last one that I'll mention is free time, I want to say leisure time. You have this amazing passage in your book where you describe the first 8 minutes of waking up, and it is just non-stop. All the decisions you make to take care of your children, all the kind of things you have to take into account. And caring for young children is an extremely demanding job in terms of your cognitive bandwidth, and that has implications for things that we know matter for your well-being, like your sense of autonomy, your sense of identity. If you can't even hear yourself think, it's kind of hard to navigate the changes that almost necessarily happen as you become a new parent. So yeah, I think you're hitting on a lot of themes that subjective wellbeing economics would suggest matter, but until we have the evidence specifically on the cares of young children, we won't know the extent to which these things are more or less important, how they interact with one another, and how we might actually intervene to kind of support people to attenuate some of those challenges that they might throw up. The very last area that I'll mention is behavioural public policy. So that kind of brings some of the economic and psychological insights to bear on policy issues. And there's quite a forceful, strongly worded quote that I'm going to read that is Naomi Wolf's quote from the book, but I think is really, really powerful when we think about urban policy. What do playgrounds say to women? They say, you know what, just fuck you. You haven't anywhere to change dirty diapers. Fuck you, deal with it. You and your babies don't count enough for us to put in the plumbing. Are you going to sit for hours under the boiling sun? Okay, because you don't count, this work doesn't count. Strongly worded, but I think it's an important point, and the reason that I bring it up is if we don't take up Lucy's challenge and we don't adopt a maternal lens on the world, at least sometimes, and we don't centre carers' experiences and their well-being, quite inadvertently we might end up with policies, with urban design that says, fuck you to carers. And we don't want to do that. Lucy has lots of good suggestions in her, particularly the final chapter of her book, about policies that might actually help and support women. But I spent a little bit of time while I was walking around in my sleep-deprived state thinking about, okay, how do we take up your challenge and how might we actually centre carers' voices and experiences? I think the first thing is representation. You want to recruit and retain people who have cared for and continue to care for young children in policy-making roles, urban design roles. We also want participatory approaches. Roberta Metsola, who is just been re-elected the President of the European Parliament, she has this great line, policymakers need to listen more than they speak. We need carers and mothers and fathers and people who are minding young children to be part of the policy-making process and in those conversations all the way through as they're designed and delivered so that we don't end up with bad playgrounds and etc. And then the last thing I'd say is a bit of a pitch for subjective wellbeing research. Imagine that playground example. If we had data on what were the moments of joy and meaning and fun that parents had in those playgrounds, and what were the moments of fear and stress and anxiety, and we mapped those onto the design features of that playground, we're much, much less likely to end up in a world where that playground is saying, fuck you, or not paying attention to the needs of carers. So I hopefully have conveyed that this was a very transformative experience for me reading the book, especially at this special moment in my life with my second daughter. I think it could have equally profound effects on your thinking, and so I'm really looking forward to the conversation, and congratulations.
Thank you so much, Kate. There's so much there to unpick and to explore further. And I want a bit later on, I want to talk more about solutions and, you know, kind of these good ideas for what policies could be. But I want to take a few steps back first and ask you both about why do you think this idea of matrescence or this metamorphosis, why is it not talked about more now in urban policy and design? You, in your book, Lucy, this line jumped out at me. You said, you describe a cultural apathy towards this most dramatic transition in a person's life. And I think, you know, you mentioned there in your work, caregivers isn't a category on its own that's ever considered. So maybe if you want to start, Lucy, and if you want to follow up, why do you think it's not considered now?
Sure. Well, I think it's not just not considered in urban policy and design. It is not considered everywhere in the majority of mainstream culture and society. There was a statistic in a great book by the neuroscientist Jodie Pawlowski called Mummy Brain, and she wrote how until 2017 there were 25 studies on postpartum depression and the brain, and there were 9,085 studies on depression and the brain, and you know, between 10 to 20% of women will suffer from that, which just shows how inadequate our research, our data is, how much we neglect parental mental health. As to why, I think there are a multitude of different factors. I think we still live in this post-industrial division of the public and the private, and alongside that is a very strong societal idealization of the mother as a kind of hyper object. And alongside that, denial of the difficulties, neoliberalism, individualism, and like Kate said, a lack of people being in power making policies who have needed to change a diaper in a playground or have that knowledge and understanding of the real vulnerability of infants and you know, what they actually need day to day. They need to sleep, they need to feed regularly. And yeah, but now you know we are learning how these social factors can connect with well-being. There's some really good research which has come out in the last week by someone called Ruth Norton-Doe on perinatal loneliness, and she's found that structural drivers of perinatal loneliness include poor urban design and infrastructure, such as unsafe roads, pavements, hostile public transport, not enough places to feed and change babies. So I think we're seeing the research starting to make these connections. And I'll end on this. There's another really interesting work by Yiye Zhang at Cornell, who explored built environmental factors associated with maternal mental health and found that lower risk of postpartum depression was associated with walkable communities, multi-purpose walkable communities. So I think while we're at the beginning of putting this dramatic transition in its rightful place, there are things that we know already and could start to implement.
Super interesting. So I think from the sort of limited policy experience that I've had that economics dominates policy for good or for ill, and traditional economic thought thinks about individuals as actors in markets. So consumers, workers, they're far less likely to focus on humans and their lives than they are on consumers and workers. And so you'll see urban policy focused on things like moving tourists around so they can spend their money in cities, moving commuters from A to B so that the labour market works more efficiently and that you can actually, they're going to glean more and more productivity from people. And so I think that that's part of what's going on, is just generally in policy there isn't enough focus on humans in lives as opposed to people in markets. And so that's probably, I think, what's happening. We spend very little focus, at least in sort of economics, and thinking about unpaid, unwaged work. And we know that care labour, unpaid care labour, is a huge contribution to a functioning and positive society. It can be something from 15 to 25% of GDP if you have to put a monetary value on it, but it just isn't in the statistics that people look to, like the GDPs, the GNPs. And so it kind of becomes, your word, invisible often. So I think that that is maybe more broadly why it's missing or underestimated in policy and underfeatured in policy. From a subjective well-being perspective, why is it not coming up as much as it should in our area, my area of research? The predominant way of looking at well-being in subjective well-being research, you're always trying to get a bit better, but it looks at evaluative measures of well-being, things like life satisfaction. And if you ask a new parent, are they satisfied with their life? There's a strong social narrative there that you should say yes. There's a bit of endorsement going on. It's not so easy to say no to that question, and maybe you can't even tell yourself that you might want to say a 5 on a 10-point scale as opposed to a 9 out of 10. So I think that subjective well-being economics is overly focused on those kinds of evaluative measures, and so when you look at that in relation to parenthood, there's fairly mixed evidence. Some says it's slightly negative, some slightly positive, not a whole pile going on, so it wouldn't ring the bell and say this is a group that needs attention. Contrast that with the research that looks at experiences of well-being, and you actually see really, really interesting patterns emerge. Some research by Angus Deaton and Andy Stone suggests that it's both more positive and more negative, but that's only on the average. And there will, of course, be groups within that we need to better understand, who are having really tough day-to-day experiences of caring for young children. So I think that's what's going on in my field. More broadly in policy, I think it's more about that invisible nature of unpaid care work.
Maybe we can come back to that topic again later when we open up for questions from the audience. But I want to kind of expand. You both spoke a bit about public space and the kind of the opportunities there, or the missed opportunities. Now you said, you mentioned in your own experience that public places are hostile to the anarchy of infants, that they're not, you kind of felt out of depth all of a sudden in being in public space with a child and all the things that a child needs from you. But I wanted to also expand that to just outdoor space, the natural environment more generally, because your previous book really focuses on that, and we talk so much about the importance to healthy early childhood development to have a stimulating environment, access to the outdoors, but you have such compelling evidence to the kind of inoculative, is that the word, to how being in nature can really inoculate you against stresses about things. So, and your research is really also focused on that. So I want you to both maybe just talk a little bit about that element as well. Do you want to, if you want to go ahead.
Sure. Yes, so I spent quite a number of years researching the link between contact and connection with natural spaces, the rest of nature, and mental health. And I was writing that book and kind of finishing my research at the moment that I had my first child. So it was quite hard but interesting experience to be kind of, having postnatal anxiety and depression and kind of in that moment trying to kind of test some of my ideas, of what spaces, were helping. And so we know that there are a lot of different pathways by which restorative natural spaces can affect human health and well-being, and we could talk about those all day, but I just want to focus a bit on particular ones to do with stress and anxiety. There's a kind of staggering statistic, which is that 1 in 5 new mothers experience clinical anxiety. And we know that becoming a parent, as anyone here who has children will know, is a time of, hypervigilance, anxiety, or that's the normal experience of needing to keep a baby alive and safe. And that means that the nervous system can be highly activated. And we know that we recover from stress more quickly and more completely in restorative natural environments compared to built environments. And one of the ways that might happen is because in natural spaces, so in a park or in a woodland or by a river, studies suggest that our parasympathetic nervous system, so the nervous system connected with rest and digest and contentment and calmness, is more likely to be activated. And we're living in a modern world of high stress levels. Stress-related illnesses, stress-related diseases are really on the rise. Many of us are constantly in a state of sympathetic nervous system, kind of fight or flight. And studies suggest that the sounds of birdsong, natural sounds, phytoncides, which are the chemicals emitted by trees, can have this really kind of stress-relieving, relaxing, measurable impact on the human body. Obviously, it's not always like that. I've had very stressful times in the woods with my young children. But there is, the evidence is unequivocal that we really need it. Not even people who are, I would spend my weekends looking for insects and slime molds because I'm just a nature geek. But the evidence shows that, background nature, being in high quality green space, and your research speaks to this too, is very protective and very good for our mental health. And I think policy could much better support this by improving safe and walkable access to green spaces, considering the well-being of the vulnerable, of our children, of people in that transition, as well as cars, or even, cars are so dominant in our landscapes. And we know that biodiverse natural spaces equate to a more diverse number of potential interactions, so greater positive health and well-being benefits, rather than a kind of amenity, which is great for picnics and football and so on. Of course, it's complex, but the more biodiverse the space seems to have more impacts. Things like benches, places to sit, places to feed babies or young children, and also crucially, and I'll end on this, prioritising access for people living in disadvantaged areas to high quality restorative natural spaces, because there's such inequality of access to nature and therefore to its great health benefits.
I'd love to hear your thoughts, Kate.
Yeah, so I would just echo so much of what you said. I think the access point is a really important one, because it's all well and good, but when you look at the statistics on the inequalities in access all around the world, I have a presentation where I go through all the countries and it's the same story everywhere. Disadvantaged communities have far less access, and if you look not just access but usage, it's even worse of a picture. So there's something about how we're designing our cities that's really, really unfair when it comes to green space access, and those lovely benefits that the evidence is very clear on and that you've done a great job of detailing. When you think about green spaces acting as this buffer for people for stressful life events and this place that they can go for respite, when you think about the inequalities in that, it becomes even kind of more unfair in some ways. During the pandemic, did a case study of Irish, sort of a representative study of Irish people, and looking at how they were spending their days, a diary-based study. And the people who were faring worst were the carers for young children. It was the pandemic, so it was a very particular time, and then a lot of people had to take on schooling that they weren't previously engaged in. But the people who were most stressed in our representative sample were the carers of young children. And the place where people were most positive in terms of their affect was outdoors in nature. So even in these big moments of shift in the society, and you've got no control over lots and lots of things, those people that were able to escape to nature and have a park fared better than those that didn't. I really appreciate the point about more diverse spaces, and it can't just all be fields. The only thing I'd like to push a little bit on is we can't always have massive parks or massive access to forests. And so I'm going to draw just a little bit on a study that I carried out with a colleague of mine, Pablo Navarrete Hernandez, and we just looked at street trees in Chile. And we had photo simulations of urban areas that had been greened. We did different percentages of green, different kinds of interventions, and looking to see what difference just street trees made to people's perceptions of the safety of those places, the sort of emotions that they associated with those places. And of course, green is good and more green is better, but there is a point at which it's not so much about how much, and just the fact that it's there at all. And so ideally we want everybody to have access to open green spaces and diverse green spaces, but there is also a role to play for just greening our cities so that they become more pleasant, more positive places to be in. And those people that can't escape for long periods of time, even if they're just passing on their way to a caring duty or on their way to work, they're engaging with nature as well in that sort of micro level way.
I want to keep with that maybe a bit of a positive, hopeful theme, and maybe just to kind of have the final topic be about what we know. So, you know, we've talked a lot about tonight the vulnerability that comes in this phase of life. And, you know, you've mentioned things like sleep deprivation, loss of identity, isolation. So we kind of have, you know, postnatal depression. We have a kind of clear picture of the types of things we want to address. So I wonder if you have some thoughts on maybe how these things could be addressed by policymakers. We have a room full of policymakers here to be influenced. And I wonder, Kate, if you could maybe talk a bit about where you see this well-being as a policy objective to getting traction, and maybe what things you think could be built upon. Sure. So maybe Lucy, if you want to start.
Sure. Well, I think my kind of initial answer to this might be a little bit depressing, but I just want to tell a story of trying to get people to imagine being a new parent and a mourning of that in an urban area. So you're a new mother a few weeks after giving birth. Your partner's back at work and you're looking after the baby. You've had snatches of sleep for weeks and your body is still traumatised from birth. You need to have your stitches checked, but you can't go to the local hospital. They want you to go to a hospital half an hour away. You're worried that there might be an infection. Your baby is crying quite a lot at the moment and you're trying to establish breastfeeding, but your body really doesn't feel right and you're worried, so you need to leave the house. It takes a while to get the baby in the pram. She doesn't like the sling. You make your way to the station. It's a 15-minute walk. Stretch of the pavement is not wide enough for the pram, so you walk onto the road and you feel the adrenaline in your body as the cars are going past. It's 30 miles an hour, should be 20. There's a school opposite. She starts to scream. She looks hungry. You're singing to her, you're talking to her, trying to calm her down. You just fed her. Could she be hungry? She starts to chew her hand. She definitely looks hungry. You're looking around for a bench, looking around for somewhere to sit, a wall, somewhere you could just sit and latch her on and feed her. But there isn't anyone around. The baby's cries are getting louder. Remember, you are early postnatal. Your body feels these cries as an emergency. Your brain has been changing as significantly as it does in adolescence. So you're hypervigilant. You decide to run to the station. You pick up the baby and you hold the pram with one hand. You're still searching for a bench just in case. at the station, the lifts are broken. You ask for help, but the attendant says because of health and safety they can't help you carry the buggy up the stairs. So you wait for someone to help you, and someone does, and you're very grateful. And they help you get the pram onto the train. There's nowhere to sit, but the screams are getting louder. So you sit on the floor in the vestibule next to the toilet, and you bring the baby, and she latches, and you start to feed her. She's quiet, finally. You're dripping with sweat and adrenaline and stress. The conductor appears and asks you to fold up the buggy, because buggies are not allowed on trains in the UK. They have to be folded up. You feel something close to distress. You feel the stitches throbbing. So it's a pretty horrible story, I'm afraid. All of those things happened to me and happened to many women. So it's not like an uplifting note for me to end on. But I think all of those things could be so different, with benches, places to sit, a sense of knowing that matrescence and parenthood is a significant transition, accessibility, family-friendly public transport, spaces for people to let babies sleep, let babies feed, and so on.
And there's a lot of opportunity. You're right. I mean, it's a very visceral, story that I think a lot of people can relate to. But there's so much opportunity there. Some very small tweaks to an existing infrastructure, in this case, would have made a world of difference.
Yeah, it packs a punch. It's really, really relatable, but also very powerful, because it just brings you into the day-to-day nitty-gritty of what it is to try to navigate cities as a mom or a parent. So I have a slightly more hopeful example, not from me, but I was speaking about this topic with a good friend of mine, Felipe Ramirez, he used to work in Bogota, but he's now at the WRI. And he was telling me about an initiative that I just thought was so brilliant, and so it really takes up your challenge of giving, adopting a motherhood lens on some urban planning policy, and that's of care blocks. I don't know if anybody's come across this idea, but it's essentially in the local area, bringing a lot of government and local services into one place and also providing childcare at the same time. And so for all those predominantly women who are doing unpaid care work in Bogota, the majority of whom don't have a second level education, they're able to go and get English classes or maths classes or exercise classes, all sorts of different things in their local area, while their kids and the children that they're taking care of are being minded and doing age-appropriate activities. And if you think of like all the challenges that might come to the barriers you might have to actually getting an exercise class and feeling a little bit more physically fit in your body, or challenging your brain so that you gain new skills and maybe can identify new opportunities for you, none of that's going to happen unless the sort of caring is there and provided for. And so that's all done at a very local level. It was an initiative that was put forward by the Secretary for Women's Affairs, I believe it's called, so that's the representation. It was done in consultation with women, local women, and what they needed and what they'd like to see. That's the sort of participatory, deliberative stuff going on. And I'm sure if you did a wellbeing evaluation, it would show up as being something quite positive. So there are these kind of interesting examples emerging that we could learn a lot from, and that I think are doing exactly what your book is challenging us to try to do better. They have this nice sort of cheesy tagline, I always love these, but it was sort of taking care of those that care. In Spanish, so I'm butchering the translation, but that is, that's the sort of ethos behind that initiative and that idea. So I think that that's really, really positive, and there are positive examples other places as well. The last thing that I mentioned was wellbeing valuation. So that's just something that might be of interest to some people in the room. I know it's quite an international audience. Here in the UK since 2011, the HMRC, which is the sort of revenue and customs, decides how we cost and benefit everything in the country, has had wellbeing evaluation as part of its guidance and guidebook, and it's been updated recently. And essentially what this does is, instead of looking at sort of, preferences as outcomes that you might care for, what are people saying they want, or putting monetary values based on what it gives to the economy, they actually look at wellbeing measures as a way to decide whether a policy is worthwhile or not. So Sarah McLennan here at the Centre for Economic Performance just gave a presentation on the low traffic neighbourhoods. I don't know if you guys have heard that, but that's been a hugely sort of contentious area of policy in London, where we're slowing everybody down and we're asking people to reroute often to make local areas more walkable, more livable. And she does this great well-being breakdown where she says, okay, what are the differences it's going to make to air pollution? What are the differences it's going to make to street crime, because there's going to be more people on the streets? On the negative sense, how much is it going to cost in terms of well-being for those people who are rerouted around? And commuting actually is one of the areas that does seem to be quite negative for well-being. But what are the extra minutes, and for how many people does that apply relative to the people who are living in that area? And you can do some sort of calculus as to, you know, is this a policy that's well-being promoting overall? And you can also weight it if you wanted to say we actually want to really focus on the well-being of carers, or we really want to focus on the well-being of disadvantaged groups. You can have a weighting in that function as well. So yeah, well-being valuation is something that's emerging. It's being heavily researched here at the LSE, and UK government is warming up to the idea. So one to kind of maybe take a look at and consider in your own cities, in your own places as well.
Great. We've actually done amazingly well with time. We're right on target. So I'd love to open up the floor for questions if anyone has any. Maybe we'll take 3 questions at once and then answer them. Okay, so go ahead.
Okay, first of all, I hope I will be able to be understandable, because English is not my mother tongue since I'm Italian. I would like to share a reflection I had. I would like to connect with the concept of Lucy Jones's the neglection of the matrescence. My reflection starts since I am a social father, social parent, let's say, because I've got an adoption. We had a 9-year-old son arrived in our life when we was 44, so it was like a nuclear explosion in our life. I needed to take antidepressive drug for 1 hour. Not joking. So I know what you are speaking of. But my reflection comes first from my personal experience and then from my professional experience. And being like a social father, social parent, let's call, I have a particular, but in the time I start to focus my reflection on this point. I understand that what is missing in this situation is a community. Because every son, every maternity, every paternity is a community issue. Let's call it, if you want to joke, a community business. Now, I think this is come my professional side, it's so evident now when there is the collapse of the birth. Now, until now, because we are seen as Kate told, like individual, like a bunch of individual, not like an environment, because at the society, the economy society, look at like a bunch of individual consumer of adults, let's say. But anyway, not like an environment, like an organism, but just like individual. What is missing is to look at the society like a community. So every son is a community business. If this is not like this, there are no sons. This is what's happening now. And so my idea is, my reflection I want to share with you, total personal reflection, is the failing in considering society like a community, is the failing of the society, falling.
Thank you for that reflection. I mean, I think you're right. The ideas of isolation and everyone kind of retreating indoors, at home, alone, doing it on their own is having really negative impacts on people's well-being. Yeah. Another question?
Hi. Sorry, just to sort of finish off what that gentleman was saying with a question. So then, what can we do in terms of the design of cities so that we get back a feeling of the children aren't just the responsibility of that family or the mother, right? Which is what's happened. Because if I look at my area has definitely not got less safe, right? It used to be much rougher. But my neighbour, who's kind of in her 80s, everyone used to walk to school at a much earlier age, which is just much easier on parents, much easier to go back to work, your day's not broken up. So it's about what the gentleman's saying, it's about trust and children becoming everyone's problem. So how can we, through city design, kind of make that happen, kind of force people to like each other again?
Does anyone want to start?
Oh, it's a great question, and what the gentleman said as well is just so nailed it with its community, isn't it? And social connections. I think Kate mentioning care blocks. I mean, that just the care blocks in Bogota just seems like such a brilliant idea, a way of creating a kind of space where people can gather and be together. I mean, and I guess in the UK we had Sure Start children's centres, but thousands of them have been closed down. Libraries seem to me to be kind of the final public space, which is kind of open, free, welcoming, and many of those have been closed down. I mean, I'd like to put the question to Kate, because in a kind of post-austerity neoliberal economic landscape, how do you fight against the stripping away of social communities? Or, I mean, I suppose it's exactly what you're talking about, using these different measures of well-being.
Yeah, so certainly as a policy narrative about what we are trying to do as policymakers, I think well-being is quite powerful. I think more generally this sort of social narrative attacking the idea that you're meant to be doing it all alone. That doesn't answer the question of urban spaces, but we do have a broader issue with the sort of, this is what your book is doing, is really challenging the sort of predominant narrative that, you know, the mother, the single mother is going to do everything for a child, or the parents are going to do everything for a child. I've had a really kind of transformative experience this time round on maternity leave, because my first daughter was born in the pandemic and everything was shut. And I consider myself very, very lucky to live in a lovely part of Lewisham with lots of parks. The parks have become a place of connection. I see the same people all the time. The fact that somebody somewhere along the line did that sort of catchment area, now it's not without issues, but it does mean that the walk to school, we see the same people over and over again. At some point we had street parties, so you know their names now. And you start to have a feeling of community and a feeling that, yeah, somebody else would be looking out for your kid if they were walking down the street, as opposed to you just having to be hyper vigilant all the time. But that requires money. It requires policy priority. The libraries is another one. We have our Wednesday rhyme time. It's maybe the only free baby activity, but it's packed all the time. And it's just by the goodwill of some local lady who knows a few nursery rhymes, has taught me all the British nursery rhymes that I never knew. But these little moments mean that you start to see the same people, you have to start to have the same sense of community. And the comparison between my first maternity leave, where everything was shut down and we were locked in, compared to this time round, and my feeling of community that's developed out of having the time to be in the space and spend time in the space with my child is just really, really different. And I would wish that all spaces were like that. I know that I'm quite fortunate in the area that I live, that all those services exist. Yeah, I think there's also a question of just appetizing sort of nice, safe spaces to be in will draw people out of their homes. You know, if you have a feeling that it's going to be really, really stressful or really, really dangerous to bring your children outside, and there's cars and they're traveling fast, you're going to much more likely to isolate yourself and keep yourself home, because it's just not a pleasant experience to be out there, and so you'll do less of it. But the more that we bring in the sort of low traffic neighbourhoods and we make those places, in the small sense, very livable and positive experiences for people, I think it'll draw people out of their homes. The more they see of each other, the more they might like each other, and the more time they might actually spend together, would be my hope.
Just drawing on, or expanding on that a little bit, and I don't have a perfect answer, but I think it's what you're talking about, it's trust. You know, it's lack of trust it's what's causing people to not, and fear, so they don't want to send their kids to walk to school, or people don't know their neighbors. And so I think, you know, really well-designed public space that can help to get people out and about, and well-connected public spaces, but also the concept of doorstep space, which I think in Hackney's, I think it's Growing Up Hackney, or Making Hackney Child-Friendly, and their kind of policy document around child-friendly design. They talk about doorstep space, where you're going to have an even better chance of getting people out of their house if they're inviting spaces right where they live. And so sometimes that might mean less cars in that area, and that might bring people out. It kind of depends on the context, but I think that those kind of incremental changes where people want to spend more time outside of their house, then they will get to know each other, then that kind of lack of trust starts to starts to dissolve a little bit. You know, what that looks like in terms of infrastructure, I think really depends. But I think things that can take away some of the barriers of the fear and the lack of trust can be a starting point. Let's see, should we go here first?
Hi, my daughter's now 12, and she was born around about the time that the government switched, and I was working on the school building program, and that stopped. And I had just happened to take up forest school training because I thought it would be a good idea to get schools using their grounds more and what have you. But there I was without a job, a daughter just studying that. So I set up a little forest school in the local park, and I'm wondering if it might be a similar park to where you are, Mayo Park in Lewisham. But what I found was I had a certain intent for doing it, but that changed when parents would come with their child and get together, and sometimes under a tarpaulin when it's raining very heavily, and we might have a campfire, we might not, or what have you. It really brought a sense of camaraderie, and friendships really developed out of that program. And it was, I guess in a way, it was one of the proudest moments. Either I didn't realise at the time, I loved it. I just loved going to it, and it kind of made me think differently about financial, because they're not financially, they don't pay very well at all, and you don't know whether you're going to make £90 that day or £10 that day, but it's such a rewarding thing to do. So I think if there was a lesson from urban policy, it would be about helping facilitate that. Councils are often quite anti, oh, you're running a business, we need to charge you what we charge an ice cream vendor. We need to, it's getting through the message that actually it's so much easier just to do it and charge people £5 or £4 or whatever it is, than to wait for funding or apply for funding or what have you. That's such a complicated way. What was satisfying was just being able to go out and just do it, and it worked. So, yeah.
Should we take a few questions from the online audience, and then we'll come back to the in-person audience?
Yes, great. I can read out 3 questions.
Great.
So Manish asks, what advice do you have for urban policymakers considering the climate crisis, specifically addressing heat waves and flooding with regard to maternal and childcare, and how can health and urban decision makers collaborate to create policies and plans that best serve the interests of mothers, newborns and infants? Then the second question from Arunima, who's a senior program associate at WI India. And Arunima's question is, beyond physical interventions, which are being discussed, what potential softer measures can be deployed through policy action? And this is especially considering the loneliness, isolation and depression faced by mothers during their early times of motherhood. And then the third question from Anna from El Salvador is, city management is complex, and in many cases lower income cities have limited budgets. What do you consider to be the strategic initiatives to begin the transformation from a hard city to a more caregiver, child and elderly friendly city?
Okay, a lot of questions there. Yeah. I don't know if anyone wants to start maybe on the kind of climate crisis in relation to...
So I was going to go for the sort of green intervention forest schools to begin
Okay,
with.
go for it,
Just
yeah.
because it's an area that I'm working on at the moment. So we know, as you've really, really detailed, there's all this fantastic evidence of how good green is us, and we're more likely to use green spaces when they're nearby, so those inequalities really matter. But it's not always enough. We need to get people positively engaging, and that's where some of the behavioural science comes in, making forest schools available in local areas, encouraging people to see the value in engaging with nature experiences. I'm sure you had people who were tentatively arriving at that school maybe the first time, and then they see their kids' response to mucking around and having that really, really tiring, which is great, but also positive experience in nature, and has this sort of positive reinforcement. Another area that I'm working in is in green social prescribing. So that specifically targets people who are suffering from mental health. I work with a great charity that's based out of Richmond called Dose of Nature, and they take people who are on the NHS mental health care waiting lists, sitting there, maybe getting worse, certainly in need of care, and they engage them in a 10-week nature-based program where they meet a guide every week. It has clinical psychologist support, but they meet a nature-based guide every week, and they spend just an hour or two with them. They're encouraged to go out themselves every day, but they spend an hour or two with them doing all sorts of activities, sometimes focused on things like noticing that we know matters, learning about nature, which is also helpful, but other times just being a companion in nature and a reason to get out of the house and outdoors. So that's something that's actually been focused on a lot in, and is a more soft policy. You know, that's not the infrastructure, it's there. And the lead of that charity, Alison, she'd be very, very kind of hard on the fact that it doesn't need to be this gorgeous, perfectly manicured park. The space that they use is actually quite wild and wild on purpose, but that there's kind of little pockets of nature everywhere. And if we can find programs like the one that Dose of Nature delivers, but also things like Forest School, to get people outdoors and engaging in nature, there's this positive sort of cycle that it can build in people being more aware of nature, feeling more confident in navigating it, and recognizing it's a sort of a benefit to them when they need support for their mental health, or when they need activities to do with their kids outdoors. So yeah, there's a literature developing on green interventions that I think is really exciting, and I think it kind of points to, it's not just enough to build it. You need to think about how to encourage people to actually use those spaces, and maybe the spaces that are also not as manicured or as perfect as the sort of some of the parks that we have available to us outside the door. Yeah.
I feel like I could respond briefly a bit to the second question about softer policies. I'm not sure if this counts, but I was very interested to hear from Nikhil Chowdhury, who's an evolutionary anthropologist at the University of Cambridge. He wrote a really great piece in the recent Early Childhood Matters journal about his research. And he mentioned that he's working with the NHS, the health service in the UK, to create a kind of leaflet or pamphlet or something to give to expectant parents about kind of how we evolved, and that we need social community, and that we need groups, and the kind of evolutionary perspective. And I think something like that could be very powerful. My sense since publishing this book is that so many people, I've had a lot of people in touch with me saying that they can't articulate how they feel, or they don't feel like they're able to say how they feel. I think the stigma, the kind of psychological police state around this transition is very much an obstacle and a barrier to trusting each other and being in community. And something like that, you know, leaflet from someone who knows what they're talking about, to say, you feel weird because the way we're doing this, the way we're treating caregivers at the moment, it could be much better. And you know, we need each other, and so on. I can't remember the other question, sorry.
I mean, just to add something, I think, to that question about soft policy, there's an example that is in the course of the Urban 95 Academy curriculum. But I mean, you mentioned Sure Start, which did so many things well. But I think that idea of creating space that's free and regular for new parents to come together, maybe with the support of a midwife or a professional, is so valuable, because we say to new parents, okay, so like, don't kill this child, love every minute of it, breastfeed, do this, and that's impossible. But if you bring people together, they can talk to each other about the problems that they're having. So someone telling you, oh no, you're not holding the baby right, they're not latching because this, and then someone else is coming to tell you, actually you're not doing it because this. But if you just talk to a bunch of women who are all dealing with the same issue, you're kind of going to give this wealth of knowledge, sharing, being honest, actually, probably in that setting, saying, no, it's actually really awful and I haven't slept, and you know. So I think policies that do that, or create the space to just bring people together in a casual way, it is so valuable, and you probably achieve all of those goals that you're setting in such higher rates if you kind of have that give and take. And I also don't remember all of the questions from the online audience, but maybe we could take a couple more questions from the room before we run out of time. Sam.
So, love to build on some of the questions and some of the points you had. We've talked quite a bit, and I think one of the big strong emphasis of the course is how urban spaces and urban infrastructure can influence these experiences and these periods. Many people in the room know I'm also the behavioral science guy, so I'm going to ask you guys about behaviors. And I'd be curious if each of you could share if there are 2 or 3 behaviors you could change. It could be behaviors of self-care of caregivers, could be the behavior of the train conductor who told you, you know, I'm not going to help you move the buggy and fold up the buggy, or the behavior of the scheduling receptionist who says, oh, I'll just send her to the hospital that's 20 kilometers away, or the behavior of the car drivers who were, you know, or the behavior of partners who are maybe not supportive, or friends or community members. I'm curious, what would be the top sort of 2 or 3 behaviors if you could wave a magic wand and change? What would those behaviors be that you think could make a really big difference? And then, I guess from a behavioral perspective, I'd be curious, you know, what's the research around how do we promote some of these pro-social behaviors? Because there is actually a whole body and area of research around how do you get people to trust each other? How do you get strangers to keep an eye and cooperate with each other? How do you make people feel comfortable asking for help? So, yeah, I'd just be curious to get your reactions on, like, what are some of those key behaviors that you say, gosh, if we could, you know, flip a few of these things. I'm not trying to say there are magic bullets, but looking beyond the infrastructure part around the behaviors.
I mean, I don't know if this, I'm not a behavioural scientist, but I don't even know how you define behaviour. I think more cognitively maybe, or about thinking and feeling. But I guess one behaviour would be in all, you know, if this was a magic wand, in any meetings about policy, about anything to do with society and public life, that thinking about the caregiver and the child is just there as a given. And that is something which is kind of emphatically forced in order to work against that kind of centralisation of the market and the economic piece. And then, I mean, I think you said it. You know, the train conductor and the. I suppose, I don't know if this counts as behaviour, but I think new mothers, new parents are weirdly invisible. Like there's something very strange in our society, which means that they kind of on the streets with their prams, but we don't see them. And I think that's probably more of a mindset change, because we, you know, it's all the things we've talked about. We idealise and naturalise this experience. But I suppose to think that actually this is a vulnerable time, and people are becoming parents in a time where so much of the support has fallen away, to remember that vulnerable piece and kind of, I think I'll end on this, sometimes like a momentary moment of kindness with someone just saying a kind word to you. Like I have a bit in my book where I write about, I was in a garden centre and I had like a newborn and my toddler, and I was super tired and they were kind of chaotic. And a lady came up to me and she said, "Your shoelaces are undone." And I was just like, oh my God, like, I can't, I'm like, how am I going to do this? And then I felt her tightening her, she bent down, she did my shoelaces for me. And it was just like the most kind thing. I think sometimes in that early transition, those moments of sweetness, kindness, care just get you through the day and many days. More of that.
Yeah, more of that. I love that. I'm going to give the counter example. So I have this is maybe just me going on a rant, but I have a bugbear that you often, while you're walking around with your pram, feel invisible, but when you don't, it's often because people are quite past remarkable. So I've had people tell me that baby needs a blanket, but they have no blanket to offer me, or, you know, that baby, you know, pointing out that the baby. One lady said to me in a cafe, "God, I remember that stage and I'm so glad I'm not there." So how is that supposed to make me feel in the moment? So yes, more kindness in these micro interactions I think would do an awful lot. To feel less judged, you also are almost always judging yourself as a young sort of new parent. And so to not have to feel like you've got the eyes of others in a sort of critical way looking at you as you navigate the necessarily kind of messy things flying everywhere times in the outside world. So I think the sort of past remarkable, the sort of more judgment micro interactions, love to get rid of those, and more of the kindness and more of the good. And then there's one that I'm really, I don't have the answer, but I'm really thinking about. We have a lovely group that meets in the park near where I live every Thursday, and it was super successful at the start. It was kind of mothers at different stages. Some had multiple kids, some had one. And I think it was really beneficial for everybody. Everyone was getting a lot out of it. And as time has gone on, it's sort of fallen by the wayside a little bit. People have gotten busy and you know, there's other priorities. I know that everybody in the group was really benefiting from it, or at least they seemed like, and they would report that they were benefiting from it. And how to maintain and get carers of young children to keep showing up for social interactions, even when it's busy and it's hard. I don't know that that's on them to figure it out, but there's something about making sure that there's enough connection in your day that isn't just you and the child, and managing to maintain that over time. I'd love to see more of that. I haven't figured it out for this group, so I don't know the answers, but I think it would be very beneficial if we could. Yeah.
We probably just have time for one more question. If someone.
One thing that actually really struck me about your story, because I recall some experiences being a mother, and we're thinking sometimes, you know, how we are going to intervene the urban space and big things. Actually, we were very much inspired in the care blocks from Bogota, and we came up with a new concept called urban care corridors, thinking that we're not going to impact probably the whole block, but at least the street, and making it, you know, more friendly and green and things like that. But now thinking a little bit about Sam's questions and moving away a little bit from urban policy, I think that there's a lot to do in terms of communication. Like saying not being okay is okay. Because I think that we are so lonely, and then social media playing such an important role, portraying what like such an idealistic or romantic view of what motherhood or mother. I'm learning the new concept of what it means. That sometimes it's like, this is real, and you're probably not going to be okay. You're not going to feel fine, but there is a network there, and that is so important about coming together with other moms. And I just cried yesterday. I don't know how to do this. Help me out here. So I think that we have to do a lot in terms of communication. That's all like that.
Karima and then Sarah. Sorry.
Perhaps building on this in a different question, I sometimes push back on this idea of us going back to our childhoods, because I know the experience of my mother as an immigrant in the US was very much, there were so many spaces that were green spaces that were hostile to her. And I think with the rising tide of conservatism and fundamentalism and, you know, all the isms in the world, we're actually going to a space where we know that many different types of caregivers in certain spaces are taught that you don't have your space here. These are for my children here, and my children have offered to this space. So I'm very interested in you know, how we think about this and the policy implications for when we think about migrants, for instance. When we think about, for instance, all the children who we know are moving across the world, you know, in the US now, you know, there's no space for them. We're telling them and their caregivers, actually, no, you don't belong here. There's no space for you. So I love this because as a mother, I've been there, but I remember how many spaces as a young mother I was scared to go into because I was different looking. And, you know, when you talk about sort of the similarities of mothers as there, it's very hard to even say, okay, we're going to get to the conversation where we can talk about our vulnerability, because it's almost like you're doubly vulnerable. And I wonder, how do we use this to begin to think about policy and to affect policy on those levels where, yes, we can have these street interventions, we can have the hardware, but what's the necessary behavioral change and social policy and the communication that are actually going to make these spaces spaces where we're transforming, you know, even what our communities look like, because there's so much resistance. Even in, you know, in Africa, in Senegal, there's so much resistance for people coming from other countries and taking spaces. So I just wanted to add that a little bit.
Does anyone have a response?
It's just such an important point, and I interviewed a guy called Howard Frumkin, who's quite a kind of brilliant expert on nature and mental health, and we talked about, you know, I asked him kind of, you know, how to make public spaces accessible, and you know, and he talked about mindful and creative programming and talking to people in the area in order to break down those barriers to help people feel safe. And but it's a very important point. Yeah.
Did you want to add something, Kate?
On the sort of change in communications, I think that there is the what we need to be communicating, and there's a bit that we need to stop communicating. So Shani Urgut, who's a sociologist here, and she does a lot of work on media here in the LSE, she's done an amazing amount of work on narratives around women and motherhood. She did some great work in the pandemic, and there was this sort of, what she would call it, like a culture of positive toxicity, where it's like, we can do hard things, we can get through this, you just have to keep going, it's a privilege, all these things which yes, it is, but it's also can be very tough, and it's not a positive narrative, it's not a helpful narrative for people that are really struggling. So I think that there is, yes, definitely changes in our communication. It's not just what we should be doing in terms of positive communication around space, but we need to stop with the toxic positivity, we need to stop with sort of pushing this sort of neoliberal idea that we should be the best we could be in every guise of life, and we should never take a break, and we should never collapse in tiredness, and that we can be everything all at once. And so, yeah, I think there is communication in and around that. To your point, yeah, I would just reiterate, I think it's really, really excellent. There was some nice research that came out, but it was looking specifically at urban parks, and it talked about how different communities responded to really tall sort of forested areas, which on average is probably a good thing because it's wilder nature, so it responds better. But for some people that really, really heavily affected their sense of safety in that space from prior experiences, that particularly people who had been victims of crime before, who were overrepresented in disadvantaged communities. And so I think that there is that thing about bringing people into the conversation where, as a researcher in the general, looking at how humans respond to green space, you're never going to have that finding. But when you actually ask people and look at how their subjective well-being maps onto spaces, you start to uncover there's heterogeneity in there that's really, really important in how people are responding. And there's design features that you can change that make things safer feeling or more positive feelings. So yeah, it'd be more about bringing people into the conversation rather than having the answers myself.
I'll just add that I guess this kind of emerging concept of matrescence and the transition to parenthood, like an important point is that, you know, matrescence doesn't land equally. You know, existing inequalities, vulnerabilities are kind of thrown into sharp relief in this vulnerable time. There's a group called Black Mothers Matter who work out of Bristol, and they're doing fantastic work working with Black mothers in pregnancy and antenatal care, because you know, we know that the statistics are grotesque, like how we can live in a world where race or ethnicity is a standalone risk factor. Like that has to be a priority for our society, for, you know, our healthcare, and I suppose I think, you know, this matrescence idea, it is helpful because it illuminates those inequalities as well, and shows, you know, where people need more support and where those discrimination and barriers need to be broken down.
And we've gone slightly over time. I know some people still had more questions, but we will, I hope you can stay as well, Kate. We'll have some drinks and we have some book signings, so maybe you can ask some more questions of our guests out in the rest of the building. So please join me in thanking Kate and Lucy.